I gotta admit, I've spent a lot of nights just lying here, staring up at the dark ceiling, wondering how much of our lives are just a series of cruel, screwed-up coincidences, or if, there's actually something else pulling the strings in the background. My name is Preston. I grew up in Phu Yen, a quiet coastal stretch in central Vietnam where the ocean breeze always carries this heavy, metallic scent of sun-baked salt, decaying driftwood, and dried fish. It's the kind of place where time usually moves at a crawl. People mind their own business, the waves crash against the sea walls, and nothing truly terrible ever seems to happen. But back in 2020, things were different. It was right in the middle of the pandemic. The whole town was under strict lockdown. The streets, which were usually buzzing with motorbikes and street food vendors, were completely dead. I remember the oppressive heat of that summer. You couldn't leave your house, so you just sat there, sweating, listening to the rhythmic, hypnotic clicking of the ceiling fan spinning on its highest setting. The air felt thick, suffocating. The whole world felt like it was holding its breath, just waiting for something to snap, and something did. It just wasn't the virus. This whole thing involves a girl I grew up with. For the sake of her family's privacy, let's just call her Quinn. Look, Quinn and I had been in the same class since kindergarten. We grew up running around the same dusty, narrow alleyways where the sun barely hits the ground. We shared the same cheap ice pops, scraped our knees on the same cracked pavements, and sat through the exact same boring math lessons until middle school. But by the time we hit the 7th grade, it was glaringly obvious that we were headed in two completely different directions. You see, Quinn was beautiful. And I don't mean just pretty for a small fishing town, beautiful. I mean she had the kind of striking, effortless beauty that made conversations literally stop when she walked into a room. And she knew it. While I was burying my face in textbooks, pulling all-nighters, and stressing myself sick trying to figure out how to get into a decent university in the city, Quinn was already out there, living a life I couldn't even comprehend. She dropped out of school that year. Her family wasn't broke or anything. They made a decent living and could easily afford her tuition. But for whatever reason, she just drifted away. She started hanging out with the older crowds, the kind of guys who rode illegally modified motorbikes, smoked cheap cigarettes under the streetlights, and always seemed to be looking for trouble. By the time I was a deeply burnt-out high school senior in 2020, Quinn and I were basically two different species living in the same neighborhood. I was drowning in mock exams, and she was the local hot girl. She was the center of this underground, neon-lit social scene. If you were a teenager in Phu Yen back then, you absolutely knew who Quinn was. She was always posting on social media, always at the beach, always surrounded by older guys who looked like they'd gladly sell their own souls just to hold her hand for 5 minutes. But here's the thing about being that beautiful in a small, isolated town. It's a double-edged sword. It attracts eyes, and not all of those eyes belong to good people. Quinn's dating history was messy. She'd have a new guy orbiting her every few weeks. Most of them were harmless, just passing through, buying her drinks, hoping for a chance. But then, there was Lawson. Lawson was significantly older, a local thug who ran with a very dodgy crowd. And he wasn't just attracted to her. Obsessed isn't even a strong enough word. He was entirely consumed by her. He'd pick violent fights with any guy who even looked in her direction. He would show up uninvited at her house in the middle of the night. There were rumors that he had literally dropped to his knees on the sticky floor of a local bar, sobbing uncontrollably, begging her to take him back after she dumped him. It was incredibly pathetic, highly unhinged behavior. But Quinn, man, I don't want to speak ill of her, but she was young, naive, and maybe a little materialistic. She liked the constant attention. She liked the feeling of power it gave her. She liked the expensive things people bought to win her over. The very last time anyone ever saw her alive was a Tuesday evening. Lawson had sent her a long, desperate message. He told her he accepted the breakup, but he had bought her a final "I'm sorry" gift, a brand new, top-of-the-line iPhone. That phone probably cost him around 30 million dong, roughly $1,200. In our town, especially for a sketchy guy like him, who was barely scraping by, that was an absolute fortune. He told her it was a parting gift, a way to end things on good terms. Quinn, thinking she had nothing to lose and a free phone to gain, agreed to meet him at a secluded spot near the coast. She thought she was walking into an awkward apology. Instead, she walked right into a nightmare. For 3 days, the town was painfully quiet. Her parents filed a missing persons report, but with the lockdown in full effect, the search was slow. The silence in the neighborhood felt heavy, like the drop in air pressure right before a massive typhoon hits. Then, the police found her. Along the coast of Fujian, there are these long, desolate stretches of wild beach. No tourists, no streetlights, just miles of dark sand and rows of dense casuarina trees. The wind constantly whips through the needle-like leaves of those trees, creating this low, mournful rushing sound that never stops. They found her body buried under a shallow pile of loose dirt, dead leaves, and discarded trash in the middle of that grove. It was a hurried, panicked job. The local police tracked Lawson down within 72 hours because he was too erratic, too terrified by what he had done, to even cover his tracks properly. The details that leaked out were completely screwed up. Blunt force trauma to the back of the head. He had likely used a heavy, jagged stone from the shoreline. The news spread like wildfire through our locked-down town. Everyone was whispering about the tragic fate of the beautiful girl who flew too close to the sun. But amidst all the gossip, there was one specific detail tucked away in the coroner's report, something the newspapers totally ignored because it made absolutely no logical sense. When the crime scene investigators finally pulled Quinn's stiff, cold body from the dirt, her right hand was locked in a death grip. Her fingers were curled tight, frozen by rigor mortis, and clutched inside that lifeless hand was a bag of snack chips, not an empty, crumpled wrapper that had blown into the grave. A full, completely unopened, silver bag of chips. The factory seal was perfectly intact. The police just documented it and brushed it off. They figured it was just some random piece of garbage that got tangled in her clothes during the struggle, or maybe Lawson had dropped it while burying her. But they didn't know the story from a little boy who lived 3 houses down from me. Let's call him Brody. Brody was barely 5 years old at the time. He was a distant cousin of Quinn's, just a sweet, innocent little kid who used to run around the alleyways with no shoes on, playing by himself until his mom yelled for him to come inside for dinner. A few days after the police took Lawson away, Brody started having night terrors. He kept crying, telling his parents a deeply unsettling story about the night Quinn disappeared. He told them that on that specific Tuesday evening, he was playing out near the edge of the main road, right where the pavement ends and the dark dirt path leads down toward the beach. He said he saw Quinn, but she wasn't alone. She was arguing with a tall, angry man, Lawson. Now, Brody was tiny. When he heard the man raising his voice, his instincts kicked in, and he immediately ducked behind a thick cluster of overgrown bushes. He crouched there in the dirt, holding his breath. He said he didn't hear any loud screams. That's the most chilling part. There was no movie-style yelling for help, just the muffled, sickening sounds of a struggle. He saw the big man grab her violently by the hair. He saw Quinn silently thrashing, trying to push him away, her feet kicking up sand. The boy didn't understand the gravity of what he was watching. He just knew the scary man was hurting his sister, Quinn. Terrified, Brody scrambled backward out of the bushes, ran straight home, and tugged on his mother's shirt, crying hysterically, trying to tell her that the bad man was hurting his sister, Quinn. His parents, stressed out by the lockdown and busy cooking, completely dismissed it. They thought he was just making up bullshit stories to get attention. They actually scolded him for lying and told him to sit outside and behave. So, he did. About an hour later, the clock had just ticked past 9 p.m. Brody was sitting alone on the front step of his house. In our neighborhood, the houses sit right on the edge of the road. There are no front yards, no gates, just your front door, a tiny concrete step, and the asphalt. The street was entirely deserted. The sickly yellow glow of the sodium streetlights flickered, casting long, distorted shadows. The only sound was the distant hum of a refrigerator from inside the house. Brody was just sitting there, pouting, with a little plastic bowl of snacks and a soda resting on the step next to him. Then, he heard the sound of footsteps. He looked up down the empty road. He says he saw Quinn. She was walking slowly down the center of the asphalt. Brody smiled. He stood up and excitedly called out her name. She stopped. Slowly, rigidly, she turned her body toward him. Brody later told his mom that as she got closer, he felt really cold, and she looked wrong. Her clothes were torn at the shoulder. Her hair, which was usually perfect, was a tangled, matted mess, crusted with dark sand and dry leaves, and she wasn't wearing any shoes. Her bare feet were scraping against the rough pavement, leaving dusty prints. But the thing that gave the little boy nightmares was her face. She looked pale, like the color had been completely drained out of her skin. Her eyes were wide open, but she wasn't blinking. She was just staring at him with this hollow, incredibly sad expression, like she was trying to scream, but her throat wouldn't work. It scared the absolute crap out of him. She shuffled up to the concrete step. She didn't bend down. She didn't kneel to his eye level like she normally would. She just stood over him, towering in the dim yellow light, and whispered. Her voice didn't sound like Quinn. It sounded dry, raspy, like two dry leaves rubbing together. "Brody, I'm so hungry. Do you have anything I can eat?" Brody was a sweet kid. He adored his older cousin because she used to let him sit on the front of her scooter and buy him ice cream. He didn't understand why she looked so scary. He just knew she was sad. He reached over to his little snack pile, grabbed an unopened silver bag of chips, and held it out to her in his tiny hands. She slowly reached out. He said her fingers brushed against his knuckles when she took the bag. It felt like touching a block of ice from the deep freezer. Just a piercing, unnatural cold. She took the chips. She didn't say thank you. The expression on her dead face never changed. She just turned around, her bare feet scraping against the asphalt again. Scuff, drag, scuff, drag, and walked straight toward the dark path leading to the Casuarina Grove, the exact spot where her body was rotting. Now, I want you to really think about the timeline here. By 9 p.m. that night, according to the official coroner's report, the time of death, and Lawson's own eventual confession, Quinn was already dead. Lawson had already struck her with that stone. Her heart had already stopped beating. At 9 p.m., Lawson was in the middle of a blind panic, physically dragging her heavy, lifeless corpse through the dirt toward the trees to hide her. The spot where Brody was sitting on his porch handing over that bag of chips was barely 300 meters away from the murder scene. When the detectives finally interrogated Lawson, his confession matched the little boy's story about the argument perfectly, down to the exact minute. But Lawson swore on his life, sobbing in the interrogation room, that after he hit her, she never got back up. He never saw anyone else on that road. He was completely alone, in the dark, with a corpse. So, how did a dead girl walk 300 meters down an asphalt road to a 5-year-old's house and ask for a snack? And how did that exact same, unopened bag of chips end up locked in her cold, dead hand, buried beneath a foot of dirt and leaves? It makes absolutely no fucking sense. I was young, stressed out, and completely oblivious to the real horrors of the world back then. What the hell was I supposed to make of that? You can call it a trick of a traumatized kid's memory if it helps you sleep at night. You can say the police just missed a detail. But I've lived in Fuyen my entire life. I've heard 100 campfire ghost stories. This didn't feel like a story. It wasn't a cinematic jump scare. It was just a broken, terrified girl, in the moments after her own brutal murder, instinctively seeking out the only person in the world who might have shown her some kindness. To this day, Brody's family strictly forbids anyone from talking about it in their house. Brody is older now, a teenager himself, but he has a weird habit. He flat out refuses to touch or eat that specific brand of chips. He told me once that every time he sees that shiny silver packaging on a store shelf, his knuckles start to ache from the phantom memory of how freezing her hand was. As for me, I don't walk anywhere near the Casuarina trees after sunset anymore. I just can't do it. When the wind blows through those long, dark branches at night, it doesn't sound like the ocean to me anymore. It sounds like someone with a dry throat, dragging their bare feet across the asphalt, whispering, asking for something they can no longer taste. If you ever find yourself driving through Fuyan and you see a young girl walking barefoot along the coastal road in the dead of night, do yourself a favor. Don't slow down to look at her face. And for God's sake, if she looks hungry, just toss the food on the ground and keep driving. I'll be straight with you. When you're young and broke, your logic is completely skewed. You don't see red flags, you just see dollar signs. Back in the early 2000s, my husband and I were just two kids who got married with absolutely nothing to our names. We didn't have fancy degrees. We didn't have stable office jobs. What we did have was a relentless, exhausting drive to hustle. We lived in Saigon, a city where the heat is oppressive. The air always smells like exhaust fumes, and the humidity clings to your skin like a wet towel. We were trying to make it as real estate brokers, and let me tell you, it was a grind. We spent our days riding around on a beat-up Honda motorbike from 7 in the morning until the sun went down, showing plots of land, sweet-talking clients, and drinking cheap beer at roadside pubs until our stomachs hurt, just hoping to close a deal. We were scraping by, saving every single penny, desperate for a place to call our own. Then, an older relative of ours, let's call her Taylor, threw us a lifeline. Or at least, that's what we thought it was at the time. Taylor was a small-time property flipper. She'd buy run-down shitholes, patch them up, and sell them for a profit. One day, she pulled us aside and told us she had a house near the Thieu-Duc wholesale market. Now, Thieu-Duc back then wasn't the bustling urban center it is today. It was a rough-around-the-edges district on the outskirts, where the massive produce market spilled right onto the dusty highway. It was loud, chaotic, and packed with laborers. She offered us the house for 5 taels of gold. In those days, that was roughly $2,000. It might not sound like much now, but back in 2005, for a couple of broke kids, it was an absolute fortune. We had to borrow from everyone we knew just to scrape the money together. But it was a steal. A house right next to the market for that price. We signed the papers before she could even finish her sentence. What a brilliant idea, right? Yeah, a real genius move on my part. When we finally got the keys and moved in, the house was weird. Taylor told us that the previous tenant had been an old, retired doctor from one of the big state hospitals. He had rented the place to run a private, underground clinic for the market workers. Because of that, the house wasn't laid out like a normal home. The front room was sectioned off with these cheap, flimsy wooden partitions. And right there, in the middle of what was supposed to be our living space, was a metal examination bed. It was one of those cold, stainless steel hospital beds, complete with a thin, plastic-wrapped mattress and an IV drip pole standing right next to it. I took one look at it and told my husband to throw it in the trash. It was highly unprofessional and honestly, just unsettling. But my husband, he was cheap. He looked at it and said, "Look, it's a perfectly good bed. If we have friends over and they get too drunk, they can sleep on it." For whatever reason, I let it slide. We kept it. We pushed it into the corner of that partitioned room, right on the way to our actual bedroom at the back of the house. For the first week or so, everything was fine. We had friends over for a housewarming party. The place was full of noise and laughter, and we were just so damn proud to finally own a home. But once the guests left and the dust settled, the quiet crept in. And that house, it had a very specific kind of quiet. Heavy, stagnant, like the air itself was holding its breath. The first thing happened on a Tuesday. It had been raining all day, that relentless, deafening tropical downpour that turns the streets into muddy rivers. We had been out with clients for hours, soaked to the bone, cold, and completely exhausted. We didn't sell a single thing. When we finally pulled up to the house around 6 in the evening, my husband suddenly doubled over. He told me his stomach was in knots, probably from some bad street food we had for lunch. He shoved the bike handles toward me, yelled at me to bring it inside, and sprinted into the house, heading straight for the bathroom at the very back. I grumbled, rolled the heavy bike inside, locked the front door, and peeled off my dripping raincoat. The house was pitch black. The only sound was the rain hammering against the tin roof. I started walking toward our bedroom to get out of my wet clothes. To get there, I had to walk past the partitioned clinic room. The door to that room was wide open. As I walked past, I glanced inside. It was dark, but the ambient light from the street lamp outside filtered through the front window, casting long, weird shadows across the floor. And there, lying on the metal examination bed, was the silhouette of a man. He was lying flat on his back. One arm was draped over his forehead, completely covering his eyes, like someone who was exhausted, or sick, or just totally fed up with the world. I stopped in my tracks. I looked at him and sighed. "What the hell are you doing?" I said, annoyed. "I thought you said you had a stomachache and needed the toilet. Why are you lying in here in your wet clothes?" The figure on the bed didn't move, but a voice, low and incredibly tired, drifted back to me. "Yeah," the voice mumbled. I rolled my eyes. "Look, just rest for a bit. I'm gonna go change. I'll make you some porridge in a minute." "Mm-hmm," the voice hummed. I shook my head, walked past the room, and went into our bedroom at the back. I stripped off my wet clothes, dried my hair, and put on some comfortable pajamas. Just as I was finishing up, the bathroom door, which was connected to our bedroom, clicked open. My husband walked out. He was drying his hands on a towel, looking pale and completely drained. "Hey," he said, clutching his stomach. "Did you bring my dry clothes? I need a shower." I froze, my brain completely short-circuited. I stared at him. "What do you mean? You were just in the clinic room. I just talked to you." He looked at me like I was insane. "What are you talking about? I've been in the bathroom since we got home. I literally just walked out." A cold sweat broke out on the back of my neck. "Stop messing with me," I snapped, my voice shaking a little. "I literally just saw you lying on the metal bed. You answered me." His face dropped. The annoyance faded, replaced by genuine confusion. "I swear to God, I have been in the toilet this whole time. I didn't say another word. I just walked over to the clinic room and flipped the light switch. The room was empty. The metal bed was perfectly made. There were no wet spots on the mattress, no muddy footprints on the floor. Nothing." I convinced myself it was just exhaustion. Internal gaslighting, right? I told myself I was burnt out, stressed about money, and the shadows were just playing tricks on me. We were just tired. That was it. But I was wrong. A few nights later, the exhaustion excuse didn't work anymore. It was the middle of the night. The air conditioning was broken, so the room was stiflingly hot. I was sleeping on my stomach, wearing just a t-shirt and a pair of underwear because of the heat. My husband was asleep next to me, facing the wall. At exactly 2:14 in the morning, I woke up. I didn't open my eyes, but I was pulled out of sleep by the sensation of a hand. A heavy, warm hand was resting on my lower back. At first, I didn't think much of it. Husbands get handsy in the middle of the night, right? I just laid there, keeping my eyes closed, expecting him to roll over or say something, but he didn't. The hand just started to slowly, methodically rub my skin. It wasn't affectionate. It was rhythmic, deliberate, like someone examining a piece of meat at the market. This went on for a long time, 5 minutes, maybe 10. In the suffocating darkness of the room, time felt like it was stretching out. I started to feel annoyed. I shifted my weight, trying to silently tell him to knock it off and go to sleep. The rubbing stopped. There was a second of absolute dead silence. I could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator in the other room, and then the hand grabbed me. It wasn't a playful pinch. 5 fingers clamped down on my skin with brutal, crushing force. The grip was impossibly strong, digging so deep it felt like it was trying to crush the muscle beneath the fat. And then, the nails dug in. Long, sharp nails sliced into my flesh and dragged downward. "Jesus!" I screamed, jolting upright. The pain was sharp and searing, like a hot iron pressing against my skin. I spun around, furious, and slapped my husband hard across the shoulder. "What the hell is wrong with you?" I yelled. "Are you out of your mind?" My husband jolted awake, completely disoriented, blinking against the dark. "What? What happened? What did I do?" "You clawed me," I shouted, holding my side. "You practically ripped my skin off." He looked at me, his face a mix of sleep-drunken confusion and genuine hurt. "I didn't touch you. I was dead asleep. My hands were under my pillow." I wanted to scream at him, to call him a liar, but the look in his eyes stopped me. He wasn't faking it. He looked genuinely terrified by my reaction. The rest of the night, I sat up against the headboard, my heart hammering against my ribs, waiting for the sun to come up. When morning finally broke, I went into the bathroom and looked in the mirror. There, on my hip, were 5 distinct, deep scratches. The skin was broken, raw, and angry red. My husband didn't have long nails. Things escalated quickly after that. It didn't just target me anymore. About a week later, I decided to stop by a salon a few miles away to get my hair done. My husband didn't want to wait, so he drove back to the house to take a nap. He told me later what happened. He had walked into the empty house, locked the metal security gate, and gone straight into our bedroom. He turned on the TV to some boring afternoon news broadcast, laid back on the bed, and let his eyes drift shut. He wasn't fully asleep. He was in that hazy, twilight state where you can still hear the room around you. Suddenly, the audio from the TV changed. The news anchor's voice faded out, replaced by a thick, buzzing static. And underneath that static, he heard a voice. It was a man's voice. Panicked, breathless. "Doctor," the voice wheezed. "Doctor, it hurts. What did you give me? I can't breathe. I can't breathe." My husband tried to open his eyes, thinking he had accidentally changed the channel to a medical drama, but he couldn't. His eyelids felt like they were glued shut. His arms and legs were pinned to the mattress by an invisible, crushing weight. Sleep paralysis. He was completely trapped inside his own body. Then, over the sound of the TV, he heard this horrible slapping sound of bare feet dragging heavily across the tile floor, moving slowly from the clinic room down the hallway and heading straight for the bedroom. The footsteps stopped right next to the bed. My husband lay there, his heart pounding so hard he thought his chest was going to crack open. The mattress dipped. Something, crawled onto the bed next to him. He could feel the heat radiating off it. He could hear it breathing. It was a wet, ragged sound, like fluid bubbling in someone's lungs. Then, a heavy, dead weight dropped across his chest, an arm, and then a leg slung over his waist. It felt like a human body, but it was freezing cold. It just lay there, pressing him down into the mattress, wheezing directly into his ear. For what felt like an eternity, he was suffocated by the smell of it, a sickly sweet odor of rotting meat mixed with the sharp, sterile sting of rubbing alcohol. And then, just as suddenly as it started, the weight lifted. The mattress popped back up. The dragging footsteps echoed down the hall, and my husband snapped awake, gasping for air. He scrambled off the bed and ran into the hallway. The house was empty, but from the clinic room he heard this terrifying squeaking and creaking sound, the metal springs of the examination bed groaning as if someone was tossing and turning violently on top of it. He stood in the doorway, staring at the empty bed, watching the mattress depress and release all on its own. He bolted out of the house and spent the next 2 hours sitting on the curb outside the hair salon, shaking like a leaf. But the kicker is, he didn't tell me. He was too afraid I'd want to sell the house at a loss. He kept his mouth shut. If I had known, I never would have gone back. The climax of this whole nightmare happened just a few days later. We had been out entertaining some potential buyers. We were at a local pub, drinking and trying to close a deal. By 6 in the evening, my husband was completely wasted, still arguing over prices. I was exhausted, so I told him I was taking a taxi home and he could follow later. I got back to the house as the sun was setting. The alleyway was quiet. I unlocked the heavy metal security gate, the hinges screaming into the evening air. As soon as I stepped inside, I heard it. The shower was running. I could hear the water hitting the tile floor in the bathroom at the back of the house. I smiled, thinking my husband had somehow beaten me home, and was washing off the smell of the pub. "Hey," I yelled out, dropping my keys on the table. "You left the front gate unlocked, you idiot." No answer, just the sound of the running water. I walked to the bedroom to grab some fresh clothes for him. I gathered a towel and a clean shirt and walked over to the bathroom door. It was slightly ajar. "I'm coming in, you drunk," I muttered, pushing the door open. The bathroom was pitch black. The light was off. I frowned, reaching around the door frame and flicking the switch. The fluorescent bulb flickered to life. The bathroom was completely empty. There was no one inside, but the floor was flooded with water. The plastic bucket we used for bathing was tipped over on its side, rolling slightly back and forth. A cold knot tightened in my stomach. I backed slowly out of the bathroom. As soon as I stepped into the hallway, I heard this violent, rhythmic clanging sound coming from the front of the house in the clinic room, just a brutal banging of metal against the tile floor. I stood frozen, the damp towels slipping from my hands. I crept down the hallway, every instinct screaming at me to run out the front door. But I had to look. I peered around the edge of the wooden partition. On the metal bed, there was a man. He was thrashing wildly. His body was convulsing, arching off the mattress and slamming back down with terrifying force. He looked like a fish that had been pulled out of the water, drowning in the air. I thought it was an intruder. I thought someone had broken in and was having a seizure. "Hey!" I shouted, rushing into the room, my panic overriding my fear. "Hey, hold still. Let me help you." I grabbed his shoulder to stabilize him. His skin was freezing, clammy, and unnaturally stiff. I pulled him toward me, turning his face so I could see him. I will never, ever forget that fucking face. It wasn't human anymore. The head was swollen to almost twice its normal size. The skin was a sickly bruised purple, stretched tight over the bones. And his eyes, he didn't have any. Where his eyes should have been, the skin was so grotesquely swollen that it folded over itself, creating thick, smooth mounds of bruised flesh. Thick, yellow foam was bubbling out of his lips, spilling down his chin. He stopped thrashing. The eyeless, swollen face tilted slightly, looking directly at me. His jaw cracked open, unhinging slightly, and a wet, gurgling voice spilled out of his foaming mouth. "Doctor, what did you inject me with? I can't breathe. I'm dying." I let go of him like he was made of fire. I stumbled backward, tripping over my own feet, and slammed into the partition. The man rolled off the bed. He hit the floor with a sickening, wet thud. He started to drag his convulsing body toward me, his fingernails scraping against the tile, the foam leaving a trail behind him. "Help me," he gurgled. I didn't scream. I couldn't. My throat was completely paralyzed. I scrambled to my feet, turned, and bolted for the fucking front door. I didn't grab my keys. I didn't grab my phone. I didn't even put on my shoes. I just ran out into the alleyway, barefoot, and sprinted the 3 miles back to the pub where my husband was. I burst through the doors of the pub, hysterical, crying, and bleeding from where I had cut my feet on the asphalt. It took my husband 10 minutes to calm me down enough to understand what I was saying. We didn't go back to the house that night. We checked into a cheap motel, and I sat awake in the corner of the room, staring at the door until the sun came up. The next morning, we did some digging. We started asking the old vendors at the wholesale market about the doctor who used to live there. The truth came spilling out. The retired doctor hadn't just moved out. He had been arrested. A few months before Taylor bought the place, a young laborer had come into the clinic with a bad fever. The doctor, maybe out of exhaustion, maybe out of old age, had made a mistake. He gave the kid an injection, the wrong medicine, or the wrong dose. The boy went into severe anaphylactic shock. His face swelled up, his throat closed, and he suffocated to death right there on that metal bed, violently thrashing and begging for his life while the doctor watched, unable to reverse what he had done. The police hauled the doctor away in a paddy wagon. The boy went to the morgue. Taylor knew. She bought the house for practically nothing because of the murder stigma, tried to live in it, got terrified by the ghost of the suffocating boy, and immediately dumped it on us, her own family, just to make a quick buck. When we called her to confront her, she called us crazy, hung up and blocked our numbers. We sold the house 2 weeks later. You can call me a terrible person for selling that place to someone else without telling them the truth. I was young, I was terrified, and I just wanted my money back so I could escape. I deserved the judgment, but it's been nearly 20 years, and my hands still shake when I smell rubbing alcohol. And let me tell you, I have never, and will never, step foot inside a private, underground clinic again, because I know exactly what kind of mistakes get buried there. I don't know what your high school experience was like. Maybe you had sprawling green lawns, cafeteria food that vaguely resembled actual meals, and air conditioning that actually worked. But where I grew up, high school was a pressure cooker. Literally. I went to a massive public school right in the heart of the city. Picture a concrete compound baking under a relentless tropical sun. By the time 4:15 p.m. rolled around, the heat trapped in those 4-story buildings was enough to make you hallucinate. The ceiling fans in our classrooms didn't cool anything down. They just pushed the hot, sticky air around like soup in a bowl. You'd be sitting there in your stiff, white uniform, sweat gluing your shirt to your spine, completely zoned out while the history teacher droned on about some ancient dynasty. But there was one thing, one highly specific, incredibly mundane thing, that kept all 2,000 of us from completely losing our minds during that final period. It was the sound, not the school bell, not the scraping of chairs. It was the chaotic, beautiful symphony of the street vendors setting up right outside the iron gates. You see, in our city, the moment school lets out, the sidewalk transforms into a chaotic night market. There would be 10, maybe 15 of them lined up, curb to curb. Guys on beat-up motorbikes with coolers strapped to the back. Old women pushing wooden carts with squeaky wheels. If you closed your eyes and took a breath, the smells would hit you in waves. Sizzling oil, sweet spun sugar, the sharp tang of chili salt, the heavy, savory aroma of fried fish balls. It was absolute heaven for a bunch of exhausted teenagers with a few crumpled bills in our pockets. Among all that chaos, everyone's absolute favorite was an old woman named Kim. Kim was, well, she was a fixture. She was the very first person to bring handmade rice paper rolls to our corner of the city. This was years ago, long before it became a trendy street food you could find on every block. She didn't have a fancy cart, just a low plastic stool, a woven bamboo tray, and a bunch of mismatched plastic containers. But watching her work, it was mesmerizing. We would crowd around her like pigeons, practically suffocating her in the heat, just watching her weathered, wrinkled hands move. She'd lay out this thin, translucent rice paper, spritz it with a tiny bit of water to soften it, and then start layering. Fresh, pungent herbs, finely shredded green mango that made your mouth water just looking at it, tiny, perfectly boiled quail eggs, dried beef, and finally a heavy drizzle of this dark, blistering red chili oil that looked dangerous but tasted incredible. She took her time. That was the thing about Kim. You could be practically vibrating with impatience, complaining that your ride was waiting, and she wouldn't speed up. She'd just offer this tight, knowing smile and keep rolling. It took forever, but man, when she finally handed you that little plastic bag, it was worth every second. It was a routine, a safe, comforting, everyday routine, until one completely random Tuesday afternoon when the routine shattered. I remember the final bell had just rung, that sharp, ear-piercing electric trill that signaled freedom. We were doing the usual scramble, shoving textbooks into backpacks, kicking chairs out of the way, hollering at each other over the noise. I was halfway to the door, my stomach already rumbling for one of Kim's rolls. Then, the PA system crackled to life. Normally, the intercom was only used for boring administrative announcements in the morning. Hearing it at 4:15 p.m. was jarring, but what really stopped us in our tracks was the voice of the head disciplinarian. This was a guy who was famous for screaming at kids across the courtyard, a guy whose voice was usually booming and full of authority. But right then, his voice sounded thin, tight, like he was struggling to push the words out of his throat. Attention. All students are to remain in their classrooms immediately. Teachers, lock your doors. Do not let anyone into the hallways. There has been a severe accident at the front gate. Stay away from the windows. Of course, telling a bunch of teenagers to stay away from the windows is the fastest way to get them to look. We rushed to the glass louvers, pressing our faces against the panes, trying to peer over the high concrete perimeter walls of the school. From the third floor, we couldn't see the sidewalk directly beneath the gate, but we could see the street. The traffic had completely stopped. I'm talking a dead gridlock, and the people, locals from the surrounding alleyways, were swarming the area like ants to dropped sugar. Then came the sirens, the flashing red and blue lights of an ambulance painting the dusty leaves of the tamarind trees. The air in our classroom suddenly felt incredibly heavy. You know that static charge in the air right before a massive thunderstorm hits? It felt like that. The hair on my arms was standing straight up, and nobody was talking. The silence was deafening. It took a few hours for the rumors to filter through, and a few days to get the full, horrible truth. A motorized, three-wheeled cargo cart, the kind of rusty death traps you see hauling ridiculous loads around the city, had been coming down the avenue. It was overloaded with construction materials. Hundreds and hundreds of pounds of solid steel rebar. The driver had taken the corner too fast. The tires blew out, or the axle snapped. Nobody really knew. But the cart completely flipped, launching its entire payload straight onto the sidewalk, right where the vendors were set up. But here is the detail that still messes with my head to this day. The absolute sickening randomness of it all. Kim wasn't even supposed to be sitting in that exact spot. Usually, the guy who sold fried sausages claimed the space directly adjacent to the gate pillars. But he had gotten a flat tire that day and was running late. Kim, seeing the prime real estate totally empty, decided to scoot her little plastic stool over. She just wanted to be closer to the students as they poured out. It was a single choice, a 5-foot shift to the left. That's all it took. When the cart flipped, the steel rebar didn't hit the sausage guy's empty spot. It came down directly on top of her. They said it was instantaneous. At least, I really hope it was. By the time the school administration finally gave the all clear and let us out, the sun was starting to set. The street was bathed in this sickly orange light. The scene had been completely cleared. The ambulance was gone. The wrecked cart had been towed away, and the police had removed the tape. They had even brought out bags of yellow construction sand and dumped it all over the pavement to soak up the mess. We walked out of the gates in complete silence. The usual chaotic chatter was gone. As I stepped over the patch of sand, a smell hit the back of my throat. It completely overpowered the exhaust fumes and the damp city heat. It wasn't the smell of spicy chili oil or toasted rice paper. It was thick. It was metallic. It smelled like old copper pennies and raw meat. Even buried under a thick layer of dry sand, you could smell the sheer volume of life that had been violently squeezed out of a human body. It made my stomach heave. I kept my head down and walked home as fast as I could. Cities are ruthless. They don't pause for tragedy. The very next afternoon, the school bell rang, and when we walked out, the street vendors were back. The guy with the coolers, the woman with the spun sugar, they were all lined up, business as usual, serving the kids. But Kim's spot, that 5-foot stretch of sidewalk near the pillar, was completely empty. Nobody set up there. The sand had been swept away, leaving a dark, oily-looking stain on the concrete. None of the students stood near it either. We all just, subconsciously, gave it a wide berth. Nobody talked about it, but the gap in the lineup felt like a missing tooth. A few days passed. My best friend back then was a girl named Mia. Mia was one of those people who was just sensitive. She was always the one who would refuse to walk down certain dark alleys because they felt too heavy, or she'd complain about sudden migraines when visiting old buildings. We used to tease her about being a human EMF detector. It was mid-morning break. The sun was absolutely punishing. We were walking back from the canteen, sipping on iced teas. I was rambling on about the upcoming math test, completely oblivious. Suddenly, Mia stopped dead in her tracks. Her hand clamped down on my wrist, squeezing so hard her fingernails dug into my skin. "Look," she whispered. I looked at her face first. All the color had drained out of it. She looked like she was about to be sick. Her eyes were wide, fixed on the front gates at the far end of the courtyard. "What?" I asked, annoyed and pulling my wrist away. "What is it?" "It's her," Mia breathed, her voice shaking. "It's Kim. She's standing right there." I squinted against the glare of the sun. The iron gates were locked for the morning session. Beyond them, the sidewalk was completely empty. There was nothing out there except the heat waves shimmering off the asphalt, distorting the shapes of the passing cars. "Mia, there's nobody there," I said, trying to laugh it off. "You skipped breakfast again, didn't you? You're dizzy. I am not making this up," she snapped, her voice trembling. "She is standing right next to the pillar. But why is she just standing? Where is her stool? Where are her baskets?" A cold prickle of unease washed over the back of my neck. "Stop it. You're freaking me out. Let's just go inside." But Mia wouldn't move. She just kept staring. "She's wearing her old straw hat," Mia whispered, almost to herself. "She's just standing there, staring through the bars. She's looking right at us." I grabbed her arm and practically dragged her into the building. I told her the heat was getting to her, that her brain was just playing tricks because we were all still traumatized by the accident. I tried to logic it away. "That's what you do, right? You build a little wall of rational explanations to keep the crazy things out." But that wall crumbled entirely during the very next period. It was literature class. The room was pin-drop silent, the kind of heavy, sleepy silence that only happens when a teacher is writing endlessly on the board. The only sound was the rhythmic tic-tac, tic-tac of the chalk against the slate, and the hum of the useless ceiling fans. I was sitting 2 rows behind Mia, doodling in my notebook, half asleep. Without warning, the silence was shattered. It wasn't a scream. A scream would have been normal. A scream means someone saw a bug or got pinched. This was a wet, suffocated gasp, followed by the sound of a heavy wooden desk violently scraping across the floor. I jerked my head up. Mia was out of her chair, backed up completely against the wall. She had both hands clamped over her mouth, her eyes bulging out of her head, staring at the front of the classroom. She wasn't making any noise, but her chest was heaving, and tears were streaming down her face in thick, continuous rivers. She was shaking so violently that the posters on the wall behind her were rattling. The teacher dropped her chalk and rushed down the aisle. "Mia! Mia, what is wrong with you? Are you ill?" Mia couldn't speak. She just kept shaking her head, her eyes locked on the empty space right beside the teacher's wooden desk. She raised one trembling, pale finger and pointed at the empty air. It took 3 students to physically pry her away from the wall and escort her down to the infirmary. The whole class was buzzing, entirely freaked out, but the teacher demanded we get back to copying the poem. I got permission to go check on her during the change of periods. The school infirmary was a small, sterile room at the end of the ground floor hallway. It smelled like rubbing alcohol and old cotton. Mia was lying on one of the narrow cots, curled into a tight fetal position, facing the wall. I sat on the edge of the bed. "Mia, what happened up there?" She didn't turn around. When she spoke, her voice was so raspy and hollow it didn't even sound like her. She was in the room. Mia whispered. "Who?" "Kim." I swallowed hard, my mouth suddenly dry. "Mia, come on." "I was looking down at my textbook," she continued, speaking in this monotone, detached rhythm. "And when I looked up at the board, she was just standing there, right next to the teacher, facing the class." "Did the teacher see her?" I asked, feeling incredibly stupid for even asking. "No. Nobody saw her but me. She wasn't doing anything at first. Just standing. But she didn't look right." Mia pulled her knees tighter to her chest. Her posture was wrong, like her spine was bent in places it shouldn't bend, and her head was tilted down. I didn't want her to keep going, but I couldn't stop listening. I blinked, trying to make it go away. But when I opened my eyes, the blood started. What do you mean the blood started? Mia shuddered, a violent, full-body spasm. It wasn't dripping from a wound. It was oozing, seeping out of the pores of her skin, pushing through the fabric of her old shirt. It was coming out of her scalp, running down her face. It looked like she was being slowly crushed by an invisible weight, right there in front of us, like a piece of fruit being put through a press. I could hear it. I could hear the fabric tearing under the pressure. I told the nurse Mia needed to sleep and backed out of the room. I felt sick, but hiding in the infirmary didn't save Mia, because when a spirit is stuck in a loop, it doesn't care about walls. It just wants to finish its routine. Mia told me the rest of this story weeks later, after she finally stopped having night terrors. About 20 minutes after I left, the school nurse stepped out to run an errand, leaving Mia completely alone in that quiet, sterile room. The AC was humming. Mia had her eyes squeezed shut, desperately trying to force herself to sleep. Then she heard a sound from the hallway outside. It was faint at first. Slap drag, slap drag. The distinct, unmistakable sound of cheap rubber sandals shuffling against the terrazzo floor. Mia's breath hitched in her throat. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, and they were getting closer to the infirmary door. Slap drag, slap drag. Then came the voice. It wasn't a ghostly wail or a demonic growl. It was much worse. It was entirely normal. It was the exact same melodic, rhythmic sales pitch Kim used to sing when she pushed her cart through the residential alleys on weekends. Who wants rice paper rolls? Dried beef? Quail eggs? Who wants a roll, my girl? Mia's heart started hammering against her ribs so hard it physically hurt. She was completely paralyzed. She couldn't move her arms. She couldn't sit up. Her brain was screaming at her to run, but her body was locked in a state of absolute, primal terror. She kept her eyes squeezed completely shut. Please don't come in. Please, just walk past. I'm not here. The footsteps entered the room. The temperature plummeted. The smell of rubbing alcohol was instantly overpowered by the suffocating stench of copper and rotting meat. The shuffling stopped right at the foot of her cot. For an agonizingly long minute, there was dead silence. Just the hum of the AC. Her parents pulled her out of the school that very afternoon. They transferred her to a private school in a different district 2 weeks later. I thought that would be the end of it. I thought Kim was just attached to Mia for some reason. But I was so terribly wrong. The restless soul wasn't finished with our school. It was just getting started. A week later, the horror escalated from sightings to physical contact. It happened during junior PE. A girl named Tia was taking the class. They were out on the hot asphalt, doing basic warm-ups. Leg lifts, jumping jacks. Nothing strenuous. Suddenly, Tia just dropped. She didn't stumble. She just went completely limp and hit the pavement face first with a sickening thud. The PE teacher, a massive, heavily muscled guy in his 30s who spent all his free time at the gym, blew his whistle and sprinted over to her. He assumed it was heat stroke. He knelt down, grabbed her by the shoulders, and tried to scoop her up to carry her to the shade. He should have been able to lift a 14-year-old girl with one arm. But as we watched from the shade of the bleachers, something completely unnatural happened. The coach planted his feet and pulled. Tia's body didn't move. The coach grunted, adjusting his grip, his massive biceps flexing. He pulled again, putting his back into it. Nothing. It was as if Tia's small, frail body was bolted to the earth. Her dead weight had somehow multiplied. The coach's face started turning a deep, angry purple. He was panting, straining, looking around in confusion. It took 3 of the senior boys rushing over to finally help him hoist her off the ground. They started carrying her awkwardly toward the main building. Halfway across the courtyard, the coach suddenly let out a strangled, high-pitched yelp. He completely let go of Tia, just dropped her upper body onto the concrete like a sack of rocks, and collapsed onto his knees. He grabbed his crotch with both hands, his face contorting into a mask of pure, absolute agony. He was gasping for air, unable to even scream. We were all stunned. The other boys backed away in terror. It wasn't until the staff meeting later that week that the truth leaked out. The coach swore up and down that as he was carrying her, Tia's eyes had suddenly snapped open. But the eyes looking back at him didn't belong to a teenage girl. They were old, cloudy, and filled with an ancient, deeply offended malice. Tia's mouth opened, but the voice that came out was raspy, hollow, and coated in wetness. She stared right into the coach's eyes and sneered. "I am old enough to have given birth to you, you little brat. How dare you put your hands on me?" And then, Tia's small hand reached down, with a mechanical, crushing strength that defied all logic and anatomy. Her small fingers gripped the coach right between the legs and squeezed. She squeezed as hard as she could, grinding the tissue. The coach said it felt like his internal organs were being ripped out through his groin. The pain was so blinding he thought he was going to pass out. "Motherfucker," he had choked out, before his knees gave way. That incident was the breaking point, the undeniable proof that the school was dealing with something completely beyond their control. But I've spent years thinking about this, and I have to ask, what do you guys think? Why her? Why would a harmless old woman, who spent her whole life feeding kids, suddenly turn so vicious? Was she just furious that she died over nothing? A random 5-foot shift to the left? Was she mad that the world just swept sand over her and moved on the very next day? Or worse, did she even know she was dead? Maybe she was just trapped in a blind, repetitive loop, completely confused as to why the living were ignoring her sales pitch, and that confusion just curdled into pure rage. Honestly, not knowing the answer is the part that still keeps me up at night. But back then, we weren't asking those deep questions. We were just terrified. The school administration tried to keep it quiet, but panic is contagious. Parents started demanding answers. Eventually, the principal quietly paid for a massive private ceremony. They brought in a group of monks over the weekend. They didn't just chant, they performed a deep, complicated ritual meant to pull a confused soul away from the site of its trauma and guide it to a local temple where it could be properly put to rest. They burned thick, choking bundles of incense right over the spot where the cart had fallen. They offered food, fake money, and chanted for hours. It turned out Kim's family was heavily in debt and too poor to even afford a basic funeral, so her ashes had just been sitting in a cheap urn. The school fund quietly paid to have her properly interred. After that weekend, the suffocating atmosphere slowly lifted. The random drops in temperature stopped. Nobody saw the woman in the straw hat standing by the pillar anymore, but the school was permanently scarred. For the rest of the year, parents would wait in their cars down the block, refusing to let their kids stand near the front gate. The school eventually installed ugly metal barriers to push the traffic further away, effectively killing the vendor market on that side of the street. I'm 30 years old now. I work in a completely different part of the city, and honestly, I've long since lost touch with Mia. People drift apart, you know, especially after something like that. As for me, I completely gave up on street food. Haven't touched it since high school. My friends think I'm just being a germaphobe, and I just let them believe it. It's a hell of a lot easier than explaining the truth. But you can't just mute the city. Sometimes, usually when I'm working late in my apartment, I'll hear a snack vendor driving down my street. Just the slow hum of a motorbike engine and that rhythmic, echoed voice calling out their wares over a cheap loudspeaker. And I swear to God, every single time, my whole body just flinches. It's this deep, unconscious jolt, like my muscles are bracing for something terrible. Honestly, even right now, just sitting here telling you this story, my arms are completely covered in goosebumps. I know it's been years. I know they cleared the street. But somewhere in the back of my mind, I'm still terrified that one of these nights, that echoed voice is going to stop right outside my door. If you weren't there, it's hard to explain what the lockdowns felt like. I'm not talking about staying home and baking bread. I'm talking about the red zones. This was a few years back, right at the peak of everything. I was young, practically broke, and still trying to figure my life out. I had dropped out of high school in 10th grade. School just wasn't for me, and after a bunch of failed jobs, I decided to become a freelance makeup artist. I rented this dirt-cheap room in Bien Ho, a massive industrial sprawl just outside the city where the air always smells faintly of exhaust fumes and factory smoke. My boyfriend, who's my husband now, was a factory worker. We were just trying to scrape by, doing bridal makeup from my cramped room while he pulled long shifts, and then the world shut down. Literally overnight, Bien Hoa became a strict red zone. My boyfriend went to work one morning, and by noon they locked the factory gates. Nobody in, nobody out. They told him he'd have to sleep on the factory floor for a few weeks. I had to pack a bag of his clothes, run up to the gates, and hand it to him through the metal bars. By the time I walked back to my rental room, the local authorities had already dragged heavy steel barricades and coils of barbed wire across the entrance of my alley. Just like that, I was trapped. The alley I lived in was incredibly deep and narrow. It was maybe 4 feet wide, a dead-end claustrophobic tunnel where the sun barely hit the ground and the corrugated tin roof seemed to trap all the brutal summer heat inside. There were a few positive cases deeper in the alley, so we were completely sealed off. I was living alone in a tiny, suffocating box. For the first few days, I was terrified. I just sat by the window, wearing a mask inside my own room, staring out into the narrow strip of concrete. Our only lifeline was a local charity group. Every day they'd wheel these hospital carts or grocery baskets full of rice, vegetables, and sausages to the barricades, and we'd have to go out one by one to grab our rations. But the nights were the worst part. The silence of a locked-down city is unnatural. It's heavy, but that silence was constantly shattered by the wail of ambulance sirens. Every 2 or 3 nights, I'd hear the sirens approaching. My heart would jump into my throat, and I'd peek through my window. A few minutes later, a team of volunteers would walk past. There were always 6 of them. They wore full, head-to-toe white hazmat suits. You couldn't see their faces, their hair, nothing. Just white, crinkling plastic and muffled voices. Sometimes they came to escort a sick family out. Sometimes they came to drag out a body bag. I watched them for about 2 weeks. I actually felt incredibly sorry for them. Through the plastic visors, I could tell they were just kids, 18, maybe 20 years old, college students or fresh high school grads who volunteered to do the grim, heavy lifting no one else wanted to do. Sometimes I'd toss a few pieces of candy out the window for them when they walked by. Then came the night that changed everything. It was around 12:30 a.m. The heat in my room was unbearable. The ceiling fan was just pushing hot air around, and I couldn't sleep. The familiar, dreadful sound of a siren cut through the night, stopping right outside our barricades. I pushed my window open just a crack. The 6 volunteers marched in. A while later, they walked back out, escorting an entire family of 5. I heard them talking at the front of the alley. Because the family was so large, the volunteers let all 5 of the sick patients get into the back of the ambulance. The 6 kids in the hazmat suits piled into a separate government-issued SUV with blue license plates to follow them to the field hospital. I watched the vehicle speed off into the dark. I didn't think much of it and finally managed to get some sleep. The next night, I was awake again. The anxiety of the lockdown had completely wrecked my sleep schedule. I was just laying there, staring at the ceiling, listening to the hum of the fan. At exactly 12:45 a.m., I heard footsteps. It wasn't the frantic rush of an emergency, but rather this agonizingly slow and continuous scraping and stepping sound of heavy rubber boots dragging relentlessly against the rough concrete. I peeked out the window, expecting to hear the ambulance siren. But there was no siren. The alley was dead silent, except for the footsteps. It was the 6 volunteers. They were walking in a single file line, but the way they walked, it was entirely wrong. The alley was narrow, sure, but they were pressing themselves flat against the opposite wall, walking shoulder to shoulder, front to back. They were glued together. If the guy in front had stopped abruptly, the whole line would have collapsed like dominoes. Their heads were bowed low, chins tucked to their chests. They didn't speak. They didn't look left or right, just a silent, synchronized march deeper into the dead-end alley. I whispered through the window grates, asking who was on shift tonight and if they were back again. Ends of them turned around. They just kept shuffling past. I figured they were just exhausted, completely burnt out from pulling back-to-back all-nighters. I sat by the window, waiting to see who they were going to bring out. I waited 10 minutes, then 20, then half an hour. Nobody came out. Now this was a dead-end alley, a mile deep maybe, but still a dead end. Unless they phased through a brick wall, they had to walk past my window to leave. Eventually my eyes got heavy, and I convinced myself I had just missed them walking out while I was zoning out. Internal gaslighting at its finest, right? I told myself it was fine, and went to bed. But then it happened the next night, 12:45 a.m. The exact same dragging footsteps, the exact same single-file line, pressed against the wall, heads down. They walked into the dark and never came back out. By the third night, I was getting seriously creeped out. The kicker is, every morning when I went to grab my ration box, I would ask the neighbors who lived at the very end of the alley if someone had gotten sick down there, mentioning that I saw the medics go in the night before. Every single person looked at me like I was losing my mind, telling me that nobody was sick. They had all tested negative yesterday, and absolutely nobody had come down there last night. By the fourth night, I was completely weirded out. I needed to know what was going on. I stayed up, fully dressed, mask on. At 12:45 a.m., the dragging footsteps started. I watched the 6 white figures shuffle past my window, glued together like a single, terrifying centipede made of hazmat suits. Once they passed my house, I lost it. I grabbed my keys, quietly wheeled my motorbike out of my room. Yeah, I kept my bike in my room. It's a Vietnam thing. And started the engine. I drove slowly down the alley, following their path. I rode all the way to the very end, where the alley opened up into a tiny concrete courtyard with a few potted plants. It was a solid brick wall, dead end. There was no one there. Every house was pitch black, doors locked tight. I sat on my idling bike, feeling a cold sweat break out under my clothes despite the sweltering heat. Where the hell did 6 people go? I turned my bike around to head back. The alley was a straight shot. As I got closer to my house, about 50 yards from the main barricade, I saw them. About 30 yards ahead of me, the 6 volunteers in white suits were walking away from me, heading toward the barricade. My brain completely short-circuited. I had just driven the entire length of the alley. If they were heading out, I would have had to drive directly past them. But I didn't. It was physically impossible for them to be in front of me. I revved the engine, speeding up a little. As they reached the front of the alley, all 6 of them turned right, disappearing behind the barricade in absolute, chilling unison. I pulled up to the barricade a few seconds later and looked right. There was nothing, just the empty, street-lit road. A few yards away, under a small canvas tent, 3 local guards were playing cards and drinking energy drinks. I called out to the guards, my voice shaking, desperately asking where those 6 medics who had just walked out went. The guards jumped, grabbing their masks, yelling at me to ask if I was crazy, and ordering me to get back inside because I was in a quarantine zone. I insisted about the medics, telling them that 6 people in white suits had just turned the corner right there. The oldest guard glared at me and snapped that nobody had come out of there, adding that they had been sitting there for 3 hours and warning me to go back inside before he wrote me up. I pushed my bike back to my room, locked the door, and just sat on the edge of my bed shivering. The pieces were starting to click together in my head, forming a picture I really didn't want to look at. The next morning, I was waiting for the food drop. The lady running the charity was this wealthy local woman everyone called Miss Barbara. She was loud, kind, and usually very cheerful. But that morning, she looked devastated. When she handed me my styrofoam box of rice, she sighed and told me how tragic it was, mentioning she had just paid out of her own pocket to buy 6 coffins for those poor kids. My blood ran completely cold as I asked Miss Barbara what kids she was talking about. Wiping her eyes, she explained that it was the volunteers who used to work this street. She told me that a few nights ago, after they escorted a family out, the family took the ambulance while the kids took the commune's SUV. They were speeding to the hospital, trying to get back to work, when right at the big intersection a mile down the road, another ambulance blew through the crossing and T-boned them. She shook her head, adding that it killed the driver and all 6 of those young volunteers instantly, just crushing them, and noted that none of them were older than 20. I whispered to Miss Barbara that I had been seeing them every night at 12:45, walking into the alley but never leaving. At first, she told me to stop talking nonsense, but when she walked down to the end of the alley to drop off food, a couple of the teenagers down there told her the exact same thing. They had seen the white figures walking into the dead end and vanishing. When Miss Barbara came back up, her face was pale. She was a very spiritual woman, very traditional. She murmured, mostly to herself, that they didn't know they were dead because the crash had happened so fast and instantly. She explained it to me right there by the barricade. When people die a sudden, violent death, especially when they are hyper-focused on a task, their spirits can get trapped in a loop. They reset to whatever they were doing 30 minutes before the impact. For those kids, their final memory, their final uncompleted task, was walking into my alley to do their job. So every night, at the exact time they entered the alley before the crash, their residual energy repeated the motion, walking in, never finishing. Miss Barbara stated with fierce determination that she had to go tell them. Because of her charity work, she had special clearance to travel. That afternoon, she and a few of the older women who worked for her drove out to that massive empty intersection where the crash happened. I obviously couldn't go, being locked in, but she told me about it later. They set up 6 small trays of food right in the middle of the asphalt. They lit incense, and Miss Barbara stood there in the stifling heat, crying, talking to the empty air. She called out to them, telling them they had done a good job. She told them the shift was over. The patients were safe. She told them they were dead, and it was time to stop working and go home to their families. That night, I sat by my window, staring at the clock. 12:40, then 12:45, then 1 a.m. Nothing. No footsteps. No dragging boots. The alley was just empty and quiet. They never came back after that. Miss Barbara had broken the loop and sent them home. It's been years now. The lockdown is a distant memory for most people. I got married to my boyfriend. We moved out of that claustrophobic room and life went on. But I'm not gonna lie, it left a mark on me. To this day, whenever I hear an ambulance siren late at night, I freeze. My chest gets tight and I have to turn on every light in the house. I was young, broke, and scared during that time, but nothing terrifies me more than the thought of being trapped in the dark, endlessly repeating the worst moment of your life simply because no one bothered to tell you it was over. If you've ever spent time in the outskirts of Saigon, you know how it is. These places, they change so fast it'll make your head spin. Back in 2010, the area I'm talking about was just a kite field. That's what we called it, empty plots of land where the grass grew waist high and families would come on weekends to catch a breeze. It was peaceful, I guess. But by 2011, the developers moved in. They carved the land into lots, laid down some sewage pipes, put up a few streetlights, and sold everything in months. But here's the kicker. Nobody actually built anything. It became a ghost town of empty lots and overgrown weeds. And when you have that much empty space with no people and no lights, because the city didn't want to waste electricity on a neighborhood with 0 residents, the wrong kind of crowd moves in. Gambling, drugs, you name it. It was sketchy as hell. Honestly, just a screwed up place to be. The turning point was 2012. I was just a kid then, riding my bike around, seeing things I shouldn't have, like used needles and discarded wrappers in the bushes. One morning, the whole district woke up to a nightmare. A young girl, barely out of school, was found inside one of those massive concrete sewage pipes. Not the ones buried underground. These were the pipes waiting to be installed. stacked on top of each other, like hollowed-out tombs. She had been brutalized, a gang of them. They left her there, half naked and broken, shoved deep into the dark of the concrete. It was the kind of tragedy that stains a piece of earth. After that, the authorities couldn't ignore the area anymore. They built a security outpost right there, a big one, made of corrugated iron and steel, meant to house the local militia to keep the peace. Fast forward to 2015. I was 18, and honestly, a bit of a screw-up. I didn't want to go to the regular army, so my parents pulled some strings to get me into the local civil defense. For the first few months, it was easy street, sitting at the People's Committee office, drinking tea. Then, they moved me. They sent me to that specific outpost in the middle of the old kite field. By then, the neighborhood had filled in a bit. We call it an existing residential area now. A few townhouses, some cafes, a couple of internet parlors. The streetlights were actually on. But the outpost stayed. It was me and two other guys. Well, actually, just teenagers, playing dress-up as guards. Hayes and Declan. We were young, bored, and obsessed with League of Legends. For the first month, nothing happened. Then, the schedule changed. We were put on the graveyard shift, roughly 5:45 p.m. to just past 6:15 a.m. At the same time, this woman, let's call her Thalia, joined us. She was a local youth union leader. She was dealing with some real bullshit with her husband. The guy was a piece of work, always showing up at her office to scream and berate her. To escape him, she asked to be stationed at our outpost for the night shifts. She'd spend most of her time in the back room, crying quietly while we sat out front. One night, the itch to play was too strong. Hayes didn't care for games, so Declan and I convinced him to hold down the fort. We told him we'd be back by like 10:53 or something. We hopped on my motorbike and headed to a net cafe about a mile away. About 30 minutes into a match, my phone buzzed. It was a message from Hayes. He texted me saying that Talia was crying again, dragging her blankets over to sleep because of another fight with her guy, and that the whole vibe was just freaking awkward. I laughed it off. I texted him back to go over and comfort her, maybe just talk some trash to pass the time. 10 minutes later, my phone buzzed again. He said she was really howling now, making it impossible to close his eyes, and it was getting seriously creepy. I texted him back that he was being a freaking wimp and to just put on some headphones. But then, my phone rang. It wasn't Hayes. It was Talia. I picked up, expecting to hear her sobbing. Instead, her voice was cold, flat, perfectly calm. Talia's voice over the line was dead flat, demanding to know where the hell we were. I stammered out some weak excuse about grabbing food and promised we'd be right back, but she didn't buy it. She told me I needed to get my ass back immediately because Hayes was losing his absolute mind in the other room, bawling and screaming, and she was too freaked out to go near him. She hung up on me. Declan and I just looked at each other. Hayes? Crying? The guy didn't even have a girlfriend to be sad about. I messaged him, asking what his deal was since Thalia said he was crying. No reply. I called him. No answer. Then Thalia called again, and this time she was full-on panicking, shrieking for us to get back because Hayes had snapped, stripped naked, and actually tried to choke her out before cornering himself to cry. She was locked in the front office, begging for help. We didn't even wait to pay our tab. We flew back to that outpost, my heart hammering against my ribs. When we pulled up, the first thing I saw was Hayes. He ran out to meet us, but he looked wrong. He was only wearing a pair of boxers. His hair was a bird's nest, and his eyes were bloodshot and wet. He rushed us, practically foaming at the mouth, spitting out that Talia was possessed, banging on the tin walls like a wild animal, and that when he tried to help, she lunged and tried to bite a chunk out of him before stripping down to her underwear. I was so fucking confused and terrified. Hayes said Thalia was crazy, and Thalia said Hayes was crazy. We stepped inside the corrugated metal shack. It was stifling hot, the smell of old cigarettes and cheap incense hanging in the air. There she was, Thalia was sitting on the floor, her back against the metal wall. She was stripped down to her slip, staring at the ceiling with eyes that didn't look like hers. She wasn't crying anymore. Instead, she just started letting out this dry, rattling sound, like bones scraping together deep in her throat, that just kept going and going. She stood up and began walking in circles around the small office. She didn't even see us. "My name is Lyra," she whispered. Her voice was thin, like paper tearing. "I'm 18. They did it to me here. Right here." She pointed to the floor of the outpost. "They hurt me here. And then they carried me over there and put me in the pipe. It was so cold. It was so dark." My blood turned to ice. I knew the story of the girl from 2012. Her name was Lyra. And the spot where this outpost sat, it was the exact coordinate where the struggle had begun 3 years prior. We didn't know what to do. We were just teenagers in uniform. We called our commanding officer, who gave us the husband's number. 15 minutes later, the husband arrived, and the scene turned into a chaotic, tragic circus. He was trying to dress her, but she kept dodging him, laughing and screaming. "You want to hurt me too? You want to put me in the pipe?" Neighbors started gathering outside, peeking through the gaps in the tin walls. It was a mess. Suddenly, Thalia's body went limp. She hit the floor like a sack of rice. When she woke up a few minutes later, she was herself again. She remembered coming to the outpost to sleep. She remembered hearing Hayes cry, but Hayes swore on his life he never shed a tear. He told us he had fallen into a deep, unnatural sleep, and when he woke up, his pants were gone, found later tossed in a corner, and Thalia was screaming at him. They had both been open, like a beacon in the dark, that things from the other side could see clearly. That girl, Lyra, she hadn't left. She was just waiting for someone to feel enough pain, Thalia's heartbreak, Hayes' exhaustion, to let her in. A few days later, the commander, the husband, and Thalia came back with a massive offering. A roasted pig, stacks of spirit money, and enough incense to fill the field with smoke. They prayed for her soul to move on. Old-timers in the neighborhood told us later that they'd seen her many times. At like 3:47 a.m. or some ungodly hour, joggers would see a young girl in white sitting quietly on the bench inside the outpost. They thought she was just a night shift clerk. She never bothered anyone. Until that night. By 2016, the owner of the land finally came back to build. The government tore down the outpost and moved the unit elsewhere. Today there's a nice house there. A cafe sits nearby where kids drink milk tea and laugh. I'm out of the service now, working a regular job. But even now, whenever I drive past a construction site and see those big concrete sewage pipes stacked by the road, I can't look at them. I just see a dark hollow where a girl named Lyra spent her last moments. I really hope she found her way out of the dark, because some places, they don't just forget. They keep the memories in the soil. And sometimes, if you're quiet enough, the soil talks back.